All right, part two. Once you've practiced doing that curled paper drawing, you're going to advance into drawing fabric, right? This is something that I hear a lot of students say. This is kind of daunting. This is really difficult. This is something I avoid. I want you to push through and try to get out of your comfort zone. I like to use a ghost because, unlike just draped fabric over the edge of a table, this has a lot of grounding in things that we recognize visually already. So we kind of know that there's going to be this little humpy shape. We know that there's going to be a pair of eyes that tell us they kind of serve as like landmarks so that we know where to put everything else. If it were just random fabric, it might be harder to kind of identify where these key features are in space and how to draw them. So let me clean up my annotation. So before we start doing this, we're going to take a look at how to study cloth, how to look at it, um, how to not get overwhelmed by what we see. So first thing I do is I'll focus on the areas of contrast, or where are my shadows, where are my midtones, where are my highlights, right? My shadow is my darkest dark. My midtone is my middle dark. My highlight is my brightest bright. So I'm focusing on how many different areas of shadow there are, and I have counted them. There's 10 big key dark shadows. Then I go to my midtone and I count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 big midtone shadows. And for highlights, I can count 1, 2, 3, 4 really obvious highlights. So now I'm going to make note of what their shapes are. So I know how many there are. There's about 10, and I'm going to look at what their shapes are. And then I'm just going to kind of trace out those basic shapes, and then I'm going to shade them in. Once I have the shadows, I'm going to look at the shapes of the midtones. And I'm going to study those basic shapes and I'm going to draw those shapes in. And it helps me if I kind of try to look at it like when you're a kid and you're looking up at the clouds and you're like picking out shapes that you might see. So I like to look at the shapes and kind of see like, okay, what kind of shape am I looking at here? If I were looking at this shape, it kind of looks almost like a pointy little shoe. If I look at this shape, it looks kind of like a hook. I look at this shape down here, almost looks like a bird, right? So this way I can kind of demystify what I'm looking at and I can break it down into some basic shapes and start drawing them. Now, if you wanted to start off with the midtone shadows before you go into the, what have I done? Before you dive into your dark shadows, that's totally fine. You can work your way from the middle um, and add just the midtone shadows to begin with, and then add your darker shadows, and then erase away your highlights. That's totally fine. And then this is how we map out the highlights. So we're looking at all of the different shapes of our three main gradations, right? We have our highlights. What are their shapes? Midtones. What are their shapes? Shadows. What are their shapes? Then it's a little bit easier to kind of see this drawing for its individual shapes and its most basic shapes. So with that in mind, you're going to draw this ghost. And if you want, you can practice by drawing out this apple and cloth, just since I've kind of mapped out all these shadows already for you. That way you're kind of getting your bearings a little bit more, but it's definitely not a requirement. If you're totally feeling lost, I think that's a good way to start. All right, so off to the ghosts.